Today, today I want to remember Christine Cotton. She's a French whistleblower who sadly passed away on the 2nd of June 2026. I did not know her. I was not following her, and I feel as though I have lost something by not knowing about her stance because I probably would have agreed or understood where she was coming from. She reminds me of Gert van den Bosch, who I've interviewed on a number of occasions and I hope to speak to again, as someone who's taken a stance, whether or not you agree with them. They have sacrificed everything in order to protect what they think is humanity. And this is the reality of where we are now. As I said, you don't have to agree with someone, but when you see someone risk it all for the sake of a point, you must, at minimum, take them seriously. And in order to understand who she was, I've gone through all the details and I've tried to summarize things. And this is who she was in terms of her background. And she was a biostatistician. And so she spent many years looking at clinical trials and the like, and had a lot of expertise in this area. Almost, I think, 25 years of pharmaceutical research. She had her own organization, clinical research. She worked with big pharmaceutical industry companies. She had reviewed and analyzed hundreds of clinical trials. She knew how to design trials, how to analyze them, how to look at compliance. And she then was independently reviewing the vaccine trial data. And this is where it became a problem because her perspective was different from what everyone else was being told. Now, because I've listened to Gert since May, the risk of mass vaccination in the midst of a pandemic and the pressure that would happen on the virus, and everything made perfect sense, but he was not listened to either. And the implications are that when someone, and this is the point that I'm realizing, it is easy to stay silent. And for those of you who are listening, just remember this. We have all come across situations where we could or should have done something. And for whatever reason, we may not have done anything. And what you must then be able to recognize is that when somebody takes a stance that comes at a risk to their career, to their finance, you have to take them seriously. The amount of times that whistleblowers have been completely decimated is unbelievable. And we need to learn from it and try and protect them from the harm that comes. Now, I had my own experience with raising awareness. And if you are listening here, you're one of the few. If you look at my, well, you wouldn't know in terms of my reach, it has been down almost probably 95%. And I put it back to when I did this particular presentation. It was censored on YouTube. And at that time, it just completely destroyed my reach, which has never really recovered. And at that time, I did a reanalysis of the original trial and I looked in detail at the causes of death in both groups, the placebo and the vaccinated group, and I highlighted some particular patterns. And boy, did they come down on this with a barge pole, so to speak. If you want to look at it, it's still on my Substack. You can look in the description. I don't think I would put it up again because of the risks. But the point is that when there are some things, it seems that you are not allowed to touch. Okay. So let's just quickly go through what Christine was saying that caused so much problems with her and industry. And I had to reflect carefully and see whether or not I understood or agreed with what she was saying. So her perspective, specifically looking at the Pfizer rollout, was that she was concerned that the manufacturing process differed between process one and process two. So when they were doing the initial batches of vaccines, the process that they use for that would likely be different from when they have to produce millions of doses. And so she was arguing that the strategy or the checks and balances should be in place as well for process two as it was for process one. Now, I happen to speak with Headley Rees as well, who is into the regulation and the blockchain about how products are brought to market. And he was saying it was virtually impossible to do the testing on process two at that size and that scale. Because what he was saying is that when you do the first lot on a small scale, say phase one or phase two, and you do your process to get the vaccine, when you are trying to then do that instead of for say 40,000 people, you're now trying to do it for 500,000 people. That's a different process because you have to scale it up. And so he was saying that you needed to recheck it to see whether or not the safety was there for process two as was there for process one. That's very similar to what Christine was arguing. Now, the industry, because she took this to court, they disagreed, and the regulatory position was that yes, there were manufacturing changes, they're common, but there was no particular problem that they found. Additionally, when they were looking at the bridging data between the original trial and subsequently, she didn't think it was sufficient. And she's doing this from a trial analysis position. The regulators said no, they thought comparable studies were performed and they were satisfied. And because she believed this, she thought that the commercial product was inadequately tested. However, all of the big regulators said no, they thought that everything was sufficiently comparable. So what happens here is a different in perspective. I think what she was saying is that if she was running these trials, she would have put a halt to certain things in order to make sure that it was followed through. Now, you have to remember we were in a pandemic. And so in terms of speed of getting to a product, the truth is that yes, you had to cut corners. And I think regulators should be able to be honest about that, because there's no way that you can do the same thing in such a short time frame without having to cut corners. So you just have to be honest about it and open and say, okay, yeah, we did, but as best as we could, we followed the safety recommendations. That's a probably more honest answer. Now, she disagreed with that point, and as I said, she took it to court. I don't think she won the case, but she was that strongly advocating about this that she was willing to go to court on it. That is a pretty serious whistleblower. So I then took a look at some more other points in terms of largely and broadly what her thinking was, because here is what can happen is that somebody can have, say, 4 or 5 points, of which one point is wrong or not right, or they've gone off on a tangent, but the others are correct. What then happens is that the scientific community will disregard everything because they say that one point was wrong. Now, if we use that same standard when we're thinking about, say, COVID vaccines, After you were told 2 doses and it would be over, then 3, then 4, you would have completely disregarded everything that the experts were saying. So if you don't allow some degree of leeway for your critics, how can you expect the same leeway for yourself? That's part of the problem. So let's look in more detail at some of her primary trial concerns. She thought that there was not enough follow up, limited long term safety and efficacy. Now, this is blatantly obvious, meaning that you can't do long term in the short term, no matter what you think. We are only just starting to reach long term, so there is no long term safety and efficacy. So we are hoping that this is okay. Just be honest. She didn't think that some of the cases were unconfirmed. She suspected large numbers of cases were not PCR confirmed, and she probably was right. How we prove it, I don't know. She had questions about the actual trial conduct and the consistency of the data from the protocols. She's an expert. Again, that's something that regulators should be able to answer. 4, this, a placebo crossover. Now, this is, I don't know if people understand this, but what happened is that the cohort who were the placebo were then given the vaccine because they determined that it was so safe and so effective that it would be unethical for them not to get the vaccine. Now, the problem is when you do that, you suddenly have no idea in terms of longer term outcomes. Now, I understand what they were saying, but that is a biggie. I mean, she is right. You can't then know the comparison long term between the placebo and the vaccinated cohort because you then went and vaccinated all of them. So suddenly your long term data is now virtually impossible. I understand why they made the argument for it, but should it have been done? Were they so confident in the science? We'll see. Additionally, she was concerned about Ventavir. There was a whistleblower who came out who was involved in some of the trial sites. Now, this was a smaller number of sites out of the, say, 40,000. But she had said that they didn't follow practices and protocol. And this could have impacted on the outcomes because, as I said, when you look carefully at the outcomes, because what I did when I did the reanalysis, when I had the full data set, I shifted the end date from the 14th of November to the 30th of December. Now, because there was a time pressure for the vaccine, they needed to get it to the public as quickly as they could. They tried to shorten that time as much as possible. So my question was very simple. Well, what happens if you had stayed the course and done a longer period of assessment instead of the 14th of November, which was your cutoff? What happens if that cutoff was the 30th of December? You have to look in the article. I don't even know if I can talk about it, but very clearly, if the 30th of December had been used as the cutoff, it would have been a completely different conversation. And that's from their own data. And I'm just saying, you can shoot the messenger, as that happened here with Christine Cotton. But the facts are the facts. Additionally, transmission data. Again, this was a big one. Limited evidence on preventing infection and spread. I mean, I knew from day one that an injectable vaccine couldn't stimulate mucosal immunity effectively. And so therefore, even if you had some reduction of transmission, it would simply be because you had elevated levels of IgG in the bloodstream. So it's more of a leakage of antibodies. But as soon as that comes down, there is no benefit. And actually, in longer term, you may have skewed the immune system. That's a whole different conversation. The point being that we didn't have adequate data on that to analyze it properly. And so they just ran with the information and therefore rolled it out to the public. Again, I can't disagree with her. I don't know who is disagreeing with her on these points, to be frank with you, because